In his book, Bowling Alone, Robert Putnam states, "A well-connected individual in a poorly connected society is not as productive as a well-connected individual in a well-connected society. Each of us are part of a larger culture that influences the way we act, think, and collaborate with one another. But ironically, with the now endless amount of new cultures and different ways of thinking, the presence of communities and genuine social connection has plummeted significantly." So when did the shift from an emphasis on community to an emphasis on the individual start, and how? What are the pros and cons of this change, and what can we do about it moving forward? Those are the questions that I will be attempting to answer in this video. A good place we can take some ideas, and not just ideas, but real evidence from, is the book I quoted at the beginning of this video, Bowling Alone, The Collapse and Revival of the American Community by Robert Putnam. In his book, Putnam seeks to explain the decline in communities and social bonding that started happening in the United States around 1950. What Putnam did with this book is something that a lot of YouTubers, including myself, fail to do when talking about modern issues. He conducted a real study. Instead of just looking at correlations across time and assuming they were the cause, he accounted for several other factors and made sure that each of his reasons were statistically significant and had research to back them up. So here's what he found. The 5 biggest contributions to the decline in community are generational differences, TV, the pressures of time and money, urban sprawl, and the last 15% remained unexplained. So let's start off with the first one, which will end up actually tying into TV and time and money as well. Essentially, what's meant by generational differences is the differences in social habits between generations. And we can start off with political involvement. First off, Americans' interest in politics and picking a side of the political party has been on the decline. In fact, the number of eligible Americans who voted in elections dropped from 62.8% in 1960 to 48.9% in 1996. This follows the trend of a genuine disinterest in politics. People don't read newspapers as much, nor do they watch the news on TV as much. Now, why this has happened is a little harder to pinpoint. Perhaps it's because news outlets started promoting more polarizing, clickbaity, fear-driven headlines that made people feel worse about the world instead of empower them to do something about it. Or maybe it's the fact that the American government's lies have been continuously getting more and more exposed now that we have access to so much more information since the rise of the internet. So that lack of trust in our government could lead to a lack of voting and political involvement. Either way, the consequences of this in relation to community are clear. Many political activities, such as meetings and rallies, require large groups of people, aka a community of people working towards a shared goal. And although there are more political organizations than ever before, the likelihood of someone joining and committing to one of these communities is far lower. What was once a source for collaboration and potential positive change has now fizzled out into a less incentivized, more individualistic approach that each person tries figuring out for themselves. This trend can be seen not just within political parties, but within any type of social groups. All forms of civic engagement, aka group activities that try to tackle public issues, have declined. But it's really the way in which this has happened that matters the most. Before the digital age, engaging in some sort of community-based, work-based, or civil-based group almost always required face-to-face interaction. You would really work with people hands-on to progress or make some sort of positive change. But now, joining and participating in an organization could be as simple as just pressing a join button on your web browser. And the result of this is more of a reliance on centralized organizations with professional staff and no local chapters, aka getting locally involved with members of the community in real life. In this way, letting automation, comfort, and people in positions of power take over our decision-making has cost the average person a lot of their own power to make a significant change within local residency. And when people feel like what they do doesn't really make a significant change, even if they do end up finding a group like that, then they start to think, why even try to join more groups like that? That feeling of a lack of incentive to meet others and interact with others in that way is where I feel like a lot of young people's heads are at right now. Another generational change that I've talked about in previous videos is the decline in religious participation. Between 1966 and 1997, the fraction of college freshmen who avowed none as their religious preference doubled. And it's been shown in several studies that people who attend religious institutions are more likely to participate in philanthropic activities, visit with friends, and join sports groups. Along with that, those people who have still decided to be church members have become increasingly more dedicated to their religion. Meaning that not only are people who don't have any religious affiliation experiencing a lack of social connection, trust, and validation, but also the people who are still dedicated to religion are becoming increasingly less accepting of people who do not agree with their religion. As Putnam puts it, the country is becoming ever more clearly divided into two groups, the devoutly observant and the entirely unchurched. Now, I personally think that a lot of religions have flaws that need addressing, such as the cult-like nature that they try to impose on their followers, how some members treat non-members, and how they try to justify morally wrong actions. But the way in which they help the average person feel a sense of connection, albeit a pretty flawed one, is generally positive. But enough about these political and religious organizations, let's talk more about everyday life, starting with the workplace. The way in which we work now and the objective of each person within a company has changed pretty dramatically in the past 60 to 70 years. Labor unions, which are an organization of workers focused on maintaining and improving the conditions of their employment, peaked during the 1950s and 1960s. But since 1975, union membership has plummeted. Unions are a great way of reducing your chances of getting exploited for your work, but they are also a great way to build a sense of connection, community, and trust with your coworkers. With unions, work becomes less about how can we build the most profitable, fastest growing company alive, and more about how can we build something long-term that is mutually beneficial and rewarding. Without that, work tends to become very individual focused, especially considering the types of jobs that a lot of Americans work now. In your standard 9-to-5 office job, one is primarily focused on how they can either climb the ranks to make more money or how they can get out of this soul-sucking job as soon as possible and find a more impactful one. Part of that shift in focus may have to do with the type of work that the typical American is doing, but I believe it more so has to do with the fact that people are working more hours than ever and are overstressed and underpaid more than ever. With inflation rising to its highest percentage in 40 years and rent and housing prices being comically high, most people can't afford to put their focus on trying to build relationships both in and out of work. A lot of people have to work two jobs simply to just live at this point, and it leaves basically no room for participation in social organizations. So we've basically been left with no choice other than to make money our primary focus. Not only that, but it's also not even required for one to go into work anymore. Remote jobs, thanks to their flexibility, are on the rise. So even if the outrageous prices of things today weren't apparent, many people just don't find value in going into work and meeting with their coworkers face to face anyways. But let's say the average person actually does manage to get some free time on their hands outside of work to just hang out with people. What happens now? Well, the way in which we spend our free time and how we entertain each other has changed quite a bit too. So now let's look at how that change has influenced informal social connections. Let's think back to the early 20th century. What is the highest form of entertainment that one could partake in? If you wanted to escape your boredom, it was most likely gonna involve some sort of human interaction. You'd meet up with your friends to play some cards, join a club, or participate in sports. Because of this, the practice of entertaining your friends and becoming socially competent was an important skill to master. You want entertainment now? Well, you're simply one click of a button away thanks to your TV or smartphone. You want to feel like you have a social connection with someone without putting in the effort required to actually develop social skills and maintain a connection in real life? No problem, just become obsessed with watching someone online and developing a parasocial relationship with them. Or if you do have friends in real life, do you want to entertain them? That's simple, just throw something on TV or play a video game. Although one could argue that playing video games together is a healthy form of social connection. There's much less of a conversational aspect to social interactions now, and when we do interact with one another, it's much less organized. Putnam actually has a pretty unique way of explaining this in his book. He describes two types of social individuals termed, in Yiddish, mockers and schmoozers. Mockers, he says, are people who make things happen in the community. Schmoozers, on the other hand, are those who spend many hours in informal conversation and communion. According to Putnam, America has seen a significant rise in schmoozers and a decline in mockers. In fact, he says, we get together with friends about twice as often as we attend organized meetings. But even though there are more schmoozers than mockers, Americans are now still less likely to visit with or invite friends to their homes, according to several studies. And when we do end up meeting with each other anyways, it's less about organizing something fun and interactive and more so just about filling the void. I'm sure many of y'all have experienced this where you're with a group of friends and you're not actually even interacting with one another, but rather just looking down at your phones. And a few years ago, I might have thought that that is the most boomer type of shit to say, but I mean, it's pretty true. Much fewer people are participating in the family dinner dynamic, going out to a bar to get get some sort of social interaction or deciding to join a club or sports team. And so, quenching our thirst for boredom is now a much less effortful, less meaningful, and usually more individualized task. What I believe, and what Putnam believes as well, is that this has led to an overall decline in trust, honesty, and reciprocity. I've already talked about this point in my Why is Everyone Depressed video, so I won't spend too much time on it here, but essentially what is happening is due to the fact that we are not interacting with each other in real life as much, and instead interacting with our online personas, which can often be misleading, people don't really know what they can believe in or not. And not only that, but knowing absolutely everything that's going on in the lives of our peers and friends is a very unnatural process. Ironically, knowing more about people has made us feel like we truly know them less, because the ways in which we know people online doesn't always coincide with their true personalities, thoughts, and actions in real life. A collective doubtfulness in relying on other humans continues to grow, and that only makes one want to become more self-reliant. When that happens, people start to employ reciprocity less, aka a willingness to help out another person with the assumption that, at some point, that person will probably help them in some way. And this trust in others' willingness to return a favor, shake hands with them, and have an overall good outlook on each other results in many positive outcomes for society. And the outcome of this not happening as much, according to Putnam, is we are forced to rely increasingly on the law to accomplish what we used to accomplish through informal networks. And in that way, you could almost say that the government controls us because we are letting them control us by not interacting socially as much in real life and organizing more things. But even beyond that, we also need to take into account just how much false information there is out there now thanks to the internet. There are an infinite number of ways of thinking you are right and others are wrong without doing the effortful mental work necessary to be open-minded and critical with your thinking. And so mutual agreements between individuals on just about anything are more rare. In his book, Putnam backs up this claim using charts and statistics to show social trust rose from the mid-1940s, peaked in the mid-1960s, and has been dropping ever since. And I know a lot of y'all out there are having trouble connecting with people because of this general distrust, but also because a lot of people lack social competence, like I said. And a great place that anyone can start with that is to read books on improving your conversational intelligence, and you can find short form summaries of books like that on the sponsor of today's video, Shortform. If you aren't familiar with Shortform, they are a platform that are producing high quality guides to nonfiction books. They provide all the book's key ideas and insights clearly explained, plus smart commentary and analysis that they input as well, so you can further clarify the types of lessons that are presented within these books. I find that a lot of nonfiction books tend to have a lot of fluff in them just to increase the page count, and so I actually haven't read a nonfiction book in, I feel like, over a year or two now, and Shortform is really the best book summary platform that I've found, not just because the summaries are great, but also because they provide exercises with which you can do for each book, so you can directly apply what you've learned. And that's one of the most important processes of actually retaining knowledge from a book, is applying what you've learned. Now, there's actually a book summary all about conversational intelligence on the platform. It's called Conversational Intelligence by Judith Glasser. And in that book, she specifically talks about how to build trust within conversations. And like we've discussed already, trust is one of the most important aspects to building a strong social connection. 3 genres I think you guys would be interested in are society/culture, self-improvement, and relationships. So if you want access to thousands of book guides for the price of just 1 book a month, then you can get a free 5-day trial along with 20% off their annual subscription by using my unique link, shortform.com/Cole, which is also linked in the description below. Go take advantage of that offer and improve your conversation skills. Shortform is really one of my favorite sponsors on this channel. Now we are left with just one discovery that Putnam made that we have not talked about yet. Urban sprawl. If you don't know what this means, urban sprawl is the spreading out of cities and towns that is most commonly characterized by low-density residential housing. So think like a really large suburban neighborhood that's populated with single-family, single-story houses like the ones you see on screen right now. There's a lot of problems that arise with setting up our cities like this, but the most impactful one in relation to worsening the bonds of community is the long commute. In one study, researchers found annual congestion-related delay per driver rose from 16 hours in 1982 to 45 hours in 1997. In short, Americans are spending a hell of a lot more time alone in their cars. People already have to work 8 hours, and then on top of that, they have to add 2, 3, or even 4 hours to their daily commute. For most people, that is really exhausting, so they don't want to put in the effort to put themselves out there and do some sort of social activity. It doesn't become appealing at that point. But something that Putnam doesn't mention in his book that I become aware of recently and is kind of related to urban sprawl is just how different city streets are set up in America as opposed to other countries. Most streets in American cities are designed for cars to come through, have very little walkways, and are riddled with apartment housing and parking garages instead of storefronts. Whereas if you take a look at the design of many European city streets, they will have large walking areas, a lot of cafes, small shop storefronts, and maybe some rivers going through the middle. This type of structural setup encourages people to actually walk around cities, engage with each other, chill outside, and do fun activities. Most American cities are very car-centric, simply focused on commuting and business, which could undoubtedly make people less inspired to talk to one another, join a community, and form social connections. So all that's left now is the 15% of the decline in positive community that Putnam could not explain. Now, you have to keep in mind that this book was written in 2000 and the world has drastically changed since then. And I think he actually wrote a revised and updated version of that book, but I couldn't be bothered to read it. But if he were to have written that book today, he probably would have found out that the rise of social media, increase in the spread of misinformation, rise of internet echo chambers which produce disagreement, and maybe even the structural design of major cities are contributing to these community-related problems too, just like we talked about. Of course, if you can think of a glaringly obvious one that I didn't go over, then feel free to leave that in the comments below. But before you do that, I think it's important we ask the question, what can we do now, and how can we improve this situation? Because as many studies show, increasing our social capital improves our economic state, overall well-being, reduces crime, and lessens inequality. Well, the kind of good news is that we've actually seen this trend from communitarianism to individualism before in the US. In fact, America seems to go through cyclical periods where in the late 19th and early 20th century, we were very individualistic and polarizing like we are now. Then we went towards being more community focused starting in the mid 20th century, and now we are back to being more self-centered once again. This phenomenon was expressed in another one of Putnam's works, The Upswing, where he represents this trend as an upside down U. When looking at the graph as a whole, the curved line represents the rate of things like wealth equality, racial equality, and social cooperation over the past 100 years or so in the US. So we have fixed this before, meaning it is possible for us to fix it again with kind of the same solutions, but probably an updated version of those solutions. What's required of us is what was present within that era when we peaked. A progressive era which produced a solid balance between individual rights and shared ideals. As famous aristocrat Alexis de Tocqueville put it, individualism, rightly understood, is perfectly compatible with community and equality. When we share common interests and goals while respecting each person's individual rights, that is when we create a society that functions the most smoothly. We as individuals need to start a culture shift, one that transitions from always needing to be right, focusing on outwardly appearances, materialism, and clout, to community, cooperation, and trust building. It means certain restrictions must be set on the things that take us away from being encouraged to meet face-to-face in organized meetings to talk about issues, and less time needs to be focused on insane working hours just to make a living. It means we allow people to be more vulnerable and speak up about certain unfair conditions and sufferings that we all share as human beings instead of constantly judging each other at every chance we get. Because yes, a lot of us have a lot more in common than we're all led to believe by the hyper reality of the online world. And I think we are getting closer and closer to that tipping point. The young adults like myself, who were born in the mid to late 90s and basically used as guinea pigs for these emerging technologies, are now becoming more and more cognizant of the downsides of these new ways of limited face-to-face interaction. It's only being talked about more and more, and it needs to get to that point in order for the general public to start to act. Because it is the public that drives social change, not politicians, business leaders, or interest groups. When we work from the bottom up and each person slowly changes the way in which we interact with one another and converse with each other, that is when we'll actually start to see significant change. Most of us think we're completely powerless against this, but if enough of us come together and actually do this, then we can start to tilt that trend upward again. Even starting with something as simple as looking at and genuinely smiling at a stranger, sparking up some random conversation, or reaching out to a friend to remind them you're thinking about them does a hell of a lot more than you realize. Be the mocker, aka the person that starts some sort of organized community within your local residency. Start making people more aware of what I've made you aware of here, and collaborate on potential small solutions that will lead to big results. This is exactly what they did in the 60s to start to improve the opportunities and lifestyles for almost everyone, and now that almost anybody can reach a larger audience than ever, we sure as hell can do it now. Otherwise, polarization, loneliness, narcissism, and inequality will only continue to rise. Do we continue to sulk over the current state of the Western world, or do we start taking the first smallest step to actually doing something about it? Thank you very much to all my patrons on Patreon. If you don't know what this is, it's a platform separate from YouTube where I put out exclusive content, and you can talk to me one-on-one over the phone on there if you've ever wanted to do that. Link in the description. And please, if you are having trouble still forming social connections and improving your social skills, check out this playlist of mine where I go over a lot of ways to build relationships with others. That is it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. See you later.